Greetings and salutations, dear viewers, and welcome to the first in our new podcast series entitled The American Political Mythos. Over the course of this series, we are going to examine some of the common assumptions that underlie our modern political discourse and determine whether or not they deserve their place in our exalted public sphere. And I want to begin with the idea, which is really firmly entrenched in not just politics, but in society as well, that self-interest leads to a bias which is disqualifying, meaning that individual actors, because they have their own self-interest, they have their own biases, cannot be objective actors, that their self-interest influences them and that they're unable to make empirical decisions. And this is a principle that we see hold sway in a number of arenas, but most particularly in legalistic settings, right? The idea that you can have a jury which might not be able to take place in the same locality where a particularly horrific crime has occurred because this biases the entire population. The idea more simply that you can't be both judge and jury in your own trial. And this is applied not just to individuals, but to communities too, right? The idea that juries can be biased and that you have to move trials. And this is an idea which has been promulgated by some fairly influential figures throughout American history, most notably James Madison, one of the primary authors of the Constitution, believed in this, and in Federalist 10 he wrote, "No man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause, because his interest would certainly bias his judgment, and not improbably corrupt his integrity. With equal, nay with greater reason, a body of men are unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. Yet, what are many of the most important casts of legislation, but so many judicial determinations, not indeed concerning the rights of single persons, but concerning the rights of large bodies of citizens? And what are the different classes of legislators, but advocates and parties to the causes which they determine?" Okay, so here we can see this idea that self-interest means that you can't be objective. And this is true both of individuals and of entire groups of actors. This is where Madison introduces the idea that legislators are biased too. And this would seemingly erode principles of localism and federalism, because the idea of representative government is that you have people who are sovereign, who elect representatives to represent their interests, and then these representatives act in a manner that carries out those interests through legislation. So there's the idea there that interest is something that should be a positive basis for political action and for public action, and the idea that people have a right to make decisions that are most influential to them, that they have the ability to determine what is in their self-interest and then to act upon it. And this would seem to be incongruous with the idea that self-interest means that you can't be empirical, means that you can't be objective, means that you can't be rational. And again, this train of thought, we see it in Madison, but it's even earlier than that, and it's more broadly held than that. In the second treatise of government, John Locke, who is the most influential of the social contract theorists when we're talking about American politics, he greatly influenced the founders. He outlined a similar rationale to the one that James Madison did. In the second treatise of government, he writes that, "I doubt not that it will be objected that it is unreasonable for men to be judges in their own case, that self-love will make men partial to themselves and their friends, and, on the other side, that ill nature, passion, and revenge will carry them too far in punishing others, and hence nothing but confusion and disorder will follow." So again, we see this idea that bias, not only in the context of the self, but where friends and family are concerned, means that people shouldn't be judges in their own causes. They shouldn't be trusted to be impartial actors. And this really plays into the idea of the social contract and the idea that you institute this intermediary body, which is society, and which is political bodies more particularly, as these are going to be the agents who make and carry out the policy that affects the public being, the common entity rather than the private entity. Um, that you need this intermediary body to act sort of as a buffer against individual interests, because Locke believes that in a state of nature, every single individual has what he calls executive action, and this means that he can act against those who transgress him, so that he has the power to right the wrongs done to him. And there's a sort of incongruous idea again here that in a state of nature, when someone goes to excess, you have the right to then exact punishment, and this sort of basic natural morality to this, but at the same time, it's immoral because we have this idea that self-love clouds judgment and means that people can't make empirical decisions. So that would mean that the executive power of the individual in a state of nature is exercised justly, but the particular manner in which that retribution is carried out is probably not as moral because it might go too far. And conversely, you might have family members or friends who are willing to carry out retribution, although they don't have executive action over other bodies, only over themselves. So you can see the line starts to get a little blurry. And the question is, well, if you have absolute power over yourself, but yet we don't trust that you're able to exercise your rationality correctly over yourself, there's a weird disconnect between the idea of man as self-sovereign and man as someone who needs an intermediary to make sure that he stays within the bounds of reason. And perhaps in view of the erosion of federalistic principles, which occurred actually quite quickly in American government, we can see how this incongruity in thought has played out, because the extension of this idea of executive principle and of man having control over himself and the ability to judge his own affairs is really inherent to principles of federalism and principle of localism, and the idea that any sort of public issue should devolve to the greatest degree possible to the locality in which it occurred, because the people there are most familiar with the situation, have the most at stake, and are therefore supposed to be able to come up with the best and the most just solution. Now, the idea of localism being tied to justice actually predates the attitudes espoused by John Locke and by James Madison. Before self-interest was viewed as being exclusive of empiricism and the ability to secure justice, it was actually seen as the best way to ensure that honest actors prevailed. And to see the codification of this, we have to go back to Magna Carta. And Magna Carta is quite an interesting example of this, because you have to remember the historical context in which it was written. Now, the document as an actual piece of legislation is utterly worthless. It was not enacted in good faith, and it was violated almost immediately. But that doesn't change the validity of the ideas that are contained in the document, nor does it change the fact that it was a response to abuses by King John of the system of government. And before Magna Carta, the king was able to really without any sort of oversight, without any sort of check on power from any other source of authority, was able to simply issue a whim, and that was the law of the land, and that was justice. And if you didn't like it, there was really not a lot that you could do. And this meant not only that the nobility was held by the caprice of the king, but that people in localities were as well. And so Magna Carta, in an attempt to rein this in and to institute some sort of actual objective standard of good and bad against which people could be judged and which could implement some sort of rigidity and stability to the government of England, in part wrote Magna Carta and introduced the idea that perhaps justice would be best served if it was sort of exorcised out to local levels. And Article 20 of Magna Carta states that for a trivial offense, a free man shall be defined only in proportion to the degree of his offense, and for a serious offense correspondingly, but not so heavily as to deprive him of his livelihood. In the same way, a merchant shall be spared his merchandise, and a villain the implements of his husbandry, if they fall upon the mercy of a royal court. None of these fines shall be imposed except by the assessment on oath of reputable men of the neighborhood. So two things are important here. One, the concept of proportionality. For a trivial offense, you only pay a trivial recompense. For a large offense, there's a greater punishment to be had. And this means that there is an actual legal standard against which all men are judged, not just the king determining in the context of a moment and based on what his particular mood of the day is, how to treat justice, which means that one man is not necessarily held to the same account because the king is probably in a different mood from day to day. And the second thing that is important is this last idea about none of the punishments listed shall be exacted except by oaths of reputable men of the neighborhood. So these are people who are familiar with the context of the offense, they're familiar with the nature of the offender, and the assumption is that because they live around these people, because they know these people, they're going to be bound to be honest. The idea that if they then lie and say that someone who didn't actually commit an offense did, and that person is then thrown in jail, well, then his family is probably going to be upset and they're going to come after the person who lied. So because people have to actually live in communities and have to deal with their neighbors and are dependent for their survival in various ways upon neighbors, and because their welfare is affected by their actions and their words, they have a greater reason to be honest and forthright. And so here, self-interest is actually is bound by rationality. There's the idea that you engage in that cost-benefit analysis of what's the price to tell a lie versus what's the price to tell a truth. And this encourages not just short-term but long-term consideration of how one's life might be affected. So we have these two competing ideas, and the question now is, which is better? Is there the monistic idea of Locke and Madison, that individuals really in certain contexts can't be trusted with their own self-interest, and therefore government needs to step in as a regulatory body to ensure that things flow evenly, and government seizes the monopoly on power, which translates to the ability to judge what's right and what's wrong, versus the more pluralistic mindset that is represented in Magna Carta, which trusts that individuals are able to be both self-interested and rational, and that they're going to be bound to be honest by the simple fact that they have to live in communities with people around them, and that they're not going to want to offend those upon whom they might later come to rely. And that means that power is more dispersed. So that's pluralism versus monism, which is the central control by government. And the conclusion that we really have to come to is that there are inherent divisions sewn into the nature of man, and that pluralism is a system which better identifies this and recognizes that there really isn't one simple definition of good. This is not to say that there is not empirical right and wrong, but that what is right and wrong might differ slightly depending upon the elements that are in play within a given context, right? This is the idea that underlies localism. The idea that you have different kinds of communities, particularly in a country as diverse as America. You have rural communities, you have urban communities, you have industrial communities, you have farming communities. And what is the good of one community is not necessarily the good of another. This is true both in regards to the private lives of the people who live there and in terms of the public policy which is best suited to benefit that community. And the idea that is supposed to underlie federalism and localism, and indeed the very concept of limited government, which recognizes the sovereignty of man, is that people are the best judges of what that good is. They're able to look at their own situation and to orient their lives and indeed public policy in a direction that they believe is for the good. And really, part of the idea of representative government is that there is room for error, that maybe the people go astray every once in a while because they are not necessarily infallible and maybe their judgment fails them, but that because we still believe they're rational actors, there will be that course correction later on, that people are honest enough to recognize the error of their ways and correct it because, again, self-interest is an abiding concern, and the desire to live and indeed to live well is then going to make people realize and confront their past errors in judgment. Now, again, this attitude is fundamentally at odds with the idea that self-interest means that you cannot be an honest judge in your own case. Certainly, legally, there's reason to involve other actors. But when it comes to government at large, the notion that self-interest means that man can't be a judge in his own case cannot be rectified with the idea of self-government. And indeed, Madison, despite his concerns about judgment being blinded by self-interest, also does seem to recognize this. In Federalist 10, the same source we quoted earlier, he also writes that as long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. The diversity in the faculties of man, from which the rights of property originate, is not less an insuperable obstacle to uniformity of interest. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results, and from the influence of these on the sentiments and views of the respected proprietors, ensues a division of the society into different interests and parties. The latent causes of faction are thus sown into the nature of man, and we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity, according to the different circumstances of civil society. So protecting the faculties which result in the individuation of man and indeed result in the diversification of society is the first object of government. It's its fundamental task. And if government is going to protect these, and this is its first charge and its most fundamental drive, then this means that this should override whatever concerns we have about self-interest, meaning that man cannot be an objective actor in his own cause. And so perhaps what Madison said earlier about man not being able to be a judge in his own cause is modified than that, and this is meant in a very limited context. Unfortunately, this nuance tends to be lost in modern political discourse, and this idea that man can't be a judge in his own cause legally is translated to all areas of society, and the idea becomes that self-interest means that one cannot be an objective actor, that one's biases are so blinding that the individual is not to be trusted anywhere where his own interests are concerned. But of course, this violates the very principles of democratic government, and if this is the case, then the people should not be the source of government power as they are in a democratic society. And more than that, if this is true, then our entire conception of the laws of nature is just so fundamentally egregious. Because self-interest means that one has a desire to survive, which means that one is bound by objective reality. And at some point, one has to confront the realities of one's situation and orient one's desires in a manner that is going to allow existence to continue. And this means that there is some sort of rationality at play, because the individual has to be able to determine what his situation is in regards to the broader context of the material world. So self-interest cannot be fundamentally disqualifying to objectivity and rationality. This idea, which underlies so much of social discourse, is in fact a myth, and it needs to be done away with if we are going to have a more functional political discourse.